The following afternoon, Sarah found herself in an ornate sitting room within Buckingham Palace, waiting for what seemed impossible just days earlier, a private audience with Queen Elizabeth II. She wore her best dress and had spent the morning learning proper protocol from Colonel Reynolds, though she was assured that the meeting would be informal and focused on conversation rather than ceremony. Tom sat beside her, looking distinguished in his dress uniform. The transformation in his appearance and demeanor over just 2 days was remarkable. The anxiety and panic that had consumed him during their first encounter had been replaced by quiet confidence and genuine enthusiasm for their planned advocacy work. "I still can't believe this is happening," Sarah whispered to Tom as they waited. 3 days ago, I was just a tourist from Ohio taking pictures of the palace. Now I'm about to meet the Queen. Tom smiled reassuringly. "Her Majesty specifically requested this meeting because she was moved by your story and wants to support the work we're planning to do. She's been a patron of military charities for decades, so mental health support for veterans is something she cares deeply about." The door opened, and a private secretary announced the Queen's arrival. Both Sarah and Tom stood as Queen Elizabeth II entered the room. Despite being in her 90s, she moved with grace and purpose, her eyes bright with intelligence and warmth. "Your Majesty," Colonel Reynolds said, stepping forward. "May I present Miss Sarah Mitchell from Ohio and Guardsman Thomas Hartwell." Sarah curtsied as she had been taught, while Tom bowed respectfully. The Queen approached them with a genuine smile. "Miss Mitchell," the Queen said, her voice warm and clear, "I must thank you for your extraordinary compassion toward one of my guards. Your actions reflect the very best of human nature." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the moment. "Your Majesty, I'm deeply honored to meet you. I simply did what I felt was right in the moment." The Queen gestured for them, all to sit down. "That's precisely what makes your actions so remarkable, my dear. You saw someone in distress and responded with immediate kindness, without thought for rules or consequences. That kind of instinctive compassion is rare and precious." Turning to Tom, the Queen's expression became even warmer. "Guardsman Hartwell, I want you to know how proud I am of your service to our country and your courage in seeking help for your struggles. The wounds that cannot be seen are often the most difficult to bear." Tom's voice was steady but emotional as he replied, "Thank you, Your Majesty. Your support means everything to me and to all the service members who are dealing with similar challenges." The Queen settled back in her chair and looked at both of them thoughtfully. "I understand that you're planning to work together on mental health advocacy for veterans. Tell me about your vision for this work." Sarah and Tom exchanged glances before Sarah began speaking. "Your Majesty, we want to use our story to show that seeking help for mental health struggles is a sign of strength, not weakness. Too many veterans suffer in silence because they're afraid of being seen as failures or being unable to cope," Tom continued. "We're working with a charity called Battle Scars to create a campaign that will reach military families around the world. The goal is to normalize conversations about mental health and make it easier for people to ask for help when they need it." The Queen nodded approvingly. "Mental health has been a hidden crisis in military communities for far too long. I've seen the statistics about veteran suicide rates and PTSD diagnoses, and I believe your personal story could indeed make a significant difference." She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more personal. "Miss Mitchell, your story has already inspired thousands of people to share their own struggles and seek help. The palace has received letters from military families saying that seeing this incident helped them finally have conversations about mental health that they had been avoiding for years." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "Your Majesty, hearing that people have been helped by what happened means more to me than I can express. I never expected that one moment could have such an impact." The Queen smiled gently. "My dear, kindness has a ripple effect that we can rarely predict or measure. Your willingness to break protocol to help another human being has created waves of positive change that will continue long after you return to America." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with the Queen asking detailed questions about their advocacy plans and sharing her own insights from decades of working with military charities. She spoke about the importance of removing stigma from mental health treatment and the need for support systems that reached military families as well as service members themselves. "Guardsman Hartwell," the Queen said near the end of their meeting, "I want you to know that your position with the Queen's Guard remains secure. Your commanding officers have assured me that you're receiving excellent treatment, and I hope you'll continue your service when you feel ready." Tom's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Serving in the Queen's Guard has been the honor of my life, and I hope to return to active duty soon." The Queen then turned to Sarah with a special request. "Miss Mitchell, I would like to ask you to consider becoming an official patron of Battle, Scars Charity. Your story and your commitment to helping others would provide them with tremendous support for their important work." Sarah was speechless for a moment before finding her voice. "Your Majesty, I would be deeply honored to accept that role. I promise to do everything I can to support their mission." As their meeting drew to a close, the Queen stood and walked to her desk, returning with 2 small wrapped packages. "I have something for each of you," she said with a smile. Sarah's package contained a beautiful silver brooch in the shape of a heart, along with a handwritten note from the Queen thanking her for her compassion and encouraging her continued advocacy work. Tom's package contained a specially commissioned coin commemorating his service and recovery, along with a personal note from the Queen expressing her pride in his courage and dedication. "These are small tokens," the Queen said, "but I hope they will remind you both of the importance of the work you're doing and the difference that one act of kindness can make in the world." As they prepared to leave, the Queen had one final message for them. "Your story has shown the world that heroism comes in many forms. Guardsman Hartwell, your service to our country and your courage in facing your struggles make you a hero. And Miss Mitchell, your willingness to help a stranger without thought for yourself makes you a hero as well." 6 months later, Sarah and Tom's advocacy work had reached international prominence. Their public service announcements for Battle, Scars had been viewed millions of times, and they had spoken at military bases, universities, and mental health conferences around the world. Tom had successfully completed his therapy and returned to active duty with the Queen's Guard, but now also served as a peer counselor for other service members dealing with mental health challenges. His openness about his own struggles had encouraged dozens of his fellow guards to seek help when they needed it. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her job in Ohio to focus on her advocacy work full-time. She had written a book about her experience, with all proceeds going to veterans' mental health charities. The book had become a bestseller and had sparked additional conversations about the importance of compassion and mental health awareness. The palace protocols had been permanently changed to include better support systems for guards experiencing medical or psychological distress. Several other military organizations around the world had adopted similar policies, creating a lasting institutional change that would benefit countless service members. Most importantly, the friendship between Sarah and Tom had grown stronger over the months. They spoke regularly by video call, sharing updates about their advocacy work and supporting each other through the challenges of their newfound public roles. Their story had proven that a single moment of genuine human compassion could indeed change the world, one person at a time. What began as a tourist's spontaneous act of kindness had become a global movement toward greater understanding, acceptance, and support for those struggling with invisible wounds. The hug that broke protocol had become the hug that started a healing revolution, showing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply reach out and remind someone that they are not alone. "Sarah," Tom said as they prepared to part ways, I know we just met yesterday under very unusual circumstances, but I feel like you've become a genuine friend. Would you like to stay in touch after you return to Ohio?" Sarah smiled warmly. "I would love that, Tom, and I'm serious about working together on the mental health advocacy. I think we could really make a difference." As Sarah left the palace, she realized that her life had been permanently changed by a single moment of compassion. What had started as a tourist's dream vacation had become the beginning of a meaningful friendship and a calling to help others who were struggling with invisible battles. The next morning, Sarah woke to find that the story had exploded even further overnight. International news channels were covering it, and celebrities were sharing the video with messages of support for both Sarah and Guardsman Hartwell. Ellen DeGeneres had tweeted the video with the message, "This is what compassion looks like. We need more people like Sarah in the world." Sarah checked her phone to find hundreds of messages from friends, family members, and strangers from around the world. Many were sharing their own stories of struggles with mental health or experiences with anxiety and panic attacks. Reading these personal accounts made Sarah realize that her simple act had opened up a global conversation about issues that people often kept hidden. At 10 a.m., Sarah arrived at a side entrance to Buckingham Palace, where Inspector Matthews was waiting for her. The media attention had made it impossible for her to use the main gates, as dozens of reporters and cameras were stationed there, hoping to catch a glimpse of the American tourist who hugged a royal guard. "Miss Mitchell," Inspector Matthews greeted her with a smile. "I hope you're prepared for what you've started. The palace switchboard has been flooded with calls from people wanting to share their own stories or offer support to Guardsman Hartwell." As they walked through the palace corridors, Inspector Matthews explained what had been happening behind the scenes. "The royal family has been following your story with great interest. They've asked me to convey their appreciation for your compassion and your efforts to redirect media attention toward mental health awareness." Sarah was stunned. "The royal family knows about what happened?" "Indeed, they do. Your actions have sparked important conversations about support for military personnel, and that's something they care deeply about. Several members of the family have military backgrounds themselves." They arrived at a comfortable meeting room where Colonel Reynolds was waiting with a young man in civilian clothes. Sarah recognized him immediately. It was the guard she had helped the day before, but he looked completely different out of uniform. He appeared younger, more relaxed, and there was a warmth in his eyes that had been hidden behind his ceremonial mask. "Miss Mitchell," Colonel Reynolds said, standing to greet her, "I'd like you to meet Guardsman Thomas Hartwell." Tom stepped forward, and for a moment both he and Sarah seemed uncertain how to begin. Then Tom extended his hand with a gentle smile. "Miss Mitchell, I can't adequately express how grateful I am for what you did yesterday," Tom said, his voice steady but emotional. "You saw me at my lowest moment and chose to help rather than just walk away. That act of kindness quite literally saved me." Sarah shook his hand warmly. "Please, call me Sarah. And you don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone should do when they see someone in need." "That's where you're wrong," Tom replied. "Most people would have looked the other way or assumed someone else would handle it. You took a risk to help a complete stranger, and that's extraordinary." Colonel Reynolds gestured for them all to sit down. "Tom, would you like to tell Sarah about what you've been going through? I think it might help her understand the full impact of her actions." Tom took a deep breath and began to share his story. He had joined the military at 18, full of pride and determination to serve his country. His 2 deployments in Afghanistan had been successful from a military standpoint. He had performed his duties with honor and had been recognized for his bravery under fire. "But something changed during my second deployment," Tom explained. "We lost several good friends in an IED explosion, and I started having trouble sleeping. I began experiencing these overwhelming feelings of anxiety and panic, but I pushed through because I didn't want to let my unit down." He continued. "When I returned to London and was selected for the Queen's Guard, I thought the honor and pride of the position would help me overcome my struggles. Instead, the pressure and visibility of the role made everything worse. Sarah listened intently as Tom described the events leading up to the previous day's incident. He had been having increasingly frequent panic attacks, but had been hiding them from his superiors and fellow guards. The day Sarah encountered him had been particularly difficult. He had barely slept the night before and had been fighting waves of anxiety throughout his shift. "When you approached me," Tom said, "I was in full panic mode. My training told me to ignore you and maintain my position, but my body was completely out of control. I genuinely thought I was going to collapse right there in front of hundreds of tourists." Tom's eyes filled with tears as he continued. "But then you did something that no one had done since I returned from Afghanistan. You showed me genuine human compassion without asking for anything in return. In that moment, I felt less alone than I had in months." Colonel Reynolds interjected. "Sarah, what you did was textbook crisis intervention even though you probably didn't realize it. Physical comfort, verbal reassurance, and the demonstration that someone cared. Those are exactly the techniques we teach our mental health professionals." Sarah was moved by Tom's openness and vulnerability. "Tom, what you're dealing with isn't your fault. You served your country with honor, and the fact that you're struggling with the aftermath doesn't diminish that service in any way. The amazing thing," Colonel Reynolds added, "is how your story has affected other service members. Since the video went viral, we've had dozens of soldiers reach out seeking help for their own mental health struggles. Your moment of crisis, Tom, combined with Sarah's compassion, has become a catalyst for positive change." Tom nodded enthusiastically. "That's actually something I wanted to discuss with you, Sarah. I've been contacted by several veterans organizations who want to use our story to promote mental health awareness and support services. Would you be willing to work with me on that?" Sarah was surprised but intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" "There's a veterans' mental health charity that wants to create a campaign around our story," Tom explained. "They want to show that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness, and that sometimes help comes from unexpected places and people." Sarah considered the proposal carefully. "I'd be honored to help, but I want to make sure the focus stays on the real issues. Supporting veterans and promoting mental health awareness. I don't want this to become about me or my 15 minutes of fame." "That's exactly the attitude they're hoping for," Colonel Reynolds said. "The charity, called Battle Scars, has been working with veterans for over 20 years. They're proposing a series of public service announcements and speaking engagements where you and Tom could share your story and encourage people to seek help when they need it." Tom leaned forward eagerly. "Sarah, since yesterday I've started seeing a therapist who specializes in combat-related PTSD. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, I feel hopeful about my recovery. Your simple act of kindness didn't just help me in that moment. It gave me the courage to finally get the help I needed." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Tom, hearing that makes everything worthwhile. I'm so proud of you for taking that step." Colonel Reynolds handed them both some documents. "If you're both interested in moving forward with the charity work, these are some initial proposals for how you could help. But first, Tom, tell Sarah about the other developments." "Since yesterday," Tom's face lit up with excitement. "Sarah, the response to our story has been incredible. The palace has received over 10,000 letters and emails from people sharing their own mental health stories or offering support. Military families from around the world have reached out to say that seeing a respected institution like the Queen's Guard acknowledge mental health struggles has helped them feel less ashamed of their own challenges." He continued, "There's also been a concrete policy change. The Ministry of Defense announced this morning that they're implementing new protocols for recognizing and responding to mental health crises during ceremonial duties. Guards will now have a discreet way to signal for help if they're experiencing medical or psychological distress." Sarah was amazed at how quickly her spontaneous act had created tangible change. "I never imagined that one moment could have such far-reaching effects. There's something else," Colonel Reynolds said with a smile. "The Queen herself has asked to meet with both of you. She wants to personally thank you, Sarah, for your compassion, and to commend Tom for his service and his courage in seeking help." Both Sarah and Tom looked stunned. Meeting the Queen had been a distant dream for Sarah, something she had hoped might happen during a public appearance or ceremony. The idea of a personal audience was beyond anything she had ever imagined. "When would this meeting take place?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow afternoon, if you're available," Colonel Reynolds replied. "It would be a private audience, just the three of you with Her Majesty. She's specifically requested that the meeting focus on the important work you're both planning to do with veterans' mental health advocacy." As the meeting continued, Tom and Sarah discussed their plans for working with battle scars and other mental health organizations. They talked about the importance of changing the stigma around seeking help, particularly in military communities where strength and stoicism were often valued above vulnerability and openness. By the time Sarah left the palace security office, the story of her encounter with Guardsman Hartwell had already begun to spread far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. Unbeknownst to her, several tourists had captured videos of the incident on their smartphones, and the footage was making its way across social media platforms at lightning speed. Sarah decided to return to her hotel to process what had happened and to call her family back home in Ohio. She wanted to tell them about her extraordinary day before they heard about it from news reports or social media. As she walked through the London streets, she noticed people looking at her with recognition, and she began to realize that the story was becoming bigger than she had anticipated. Her phone started buzzing with notifications as she reached her hotel room. Text messages, missed calls, and social media alerts were coming in faster than she could read them. Sarah's sister had sent her a link to a Twitter video with the caption, "Is this you hugging a guard at Buckingham Palace? It's going viral." Sarah watched the video with amazement. The footage showed her approaching the guard, their brief embrace, and the obvious change in the guard's demeanor afterward. But what struck her most was how the moment looked from an outside perspective. It was clearly an act of pure human kindness that had transcended all barriers and protocols. The comments on the video were overwhelmingly positive. People from around the world were praising Sarah's compassion and discussing the importance of mental health awareness, especially for military personnel. The hashtag #OurHugThatChangedEverything was already trending in multiple countries. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Guardsman Thomas Hartwell was experiencing his own whirlwind of emotions. After completing his guard duty for the day, he had been called in for a meeting with his commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Reynolds, a respected military leader known for her fair treatment of soldiers dealing with post-combat stress. "Tom," Colonel Reynolds said, gesturing for him to sit down in her office, "I want you to know that you're not in any trouble regarding what happened today. Inspector Matthews has briefed me on the situation, and I understand that you experienced a severe anxiety episode while on duty." Tom nodded, still struggling to find words to explain what he had been going through. The panic attack had been building for days, but he had been determined to fulfill his duties despite his mounting anxiety. Military pride and his commitment to the Queen's Guard had prevented him from seeking help when he needed it most. "Sir, I want to apologize for compromising my post," Tom began, but Colonel Reynolds raised her hand to stop him. "Tom, you've served 2 tours in Afghanistan with distinction. You've earned 3 commendations for bravery and saved the lives of 2 fellow soldiers during combat operations. The fact that you're dealing with some mental health challenges doesn't diminish any of that service." Colonel Reynolds pulled out a file from her desk. "I've been reviewing your records, and I can see that you've been struggling since your return from deployment. Your performance evaluations mention increased tension, difficulty sleeping, and what your supervisors described as unusual stress responses. Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Tom looked down at his hands. "I didn't want to appear weak, sir. Being selected for the Queen's Guard is the highest honor in my military career. I thought I could handle it on my own." "Tom, Seeking help for mental health issues isn't weakness. It's strength. And what happened today proves that you're not alone in this battle. A complete stranger saw your distress and chose to help you, despite the potential consequences to herself. Colonel Reynolds turned her computer screen toward Tom, showing him the viral video of Sarah's intervention. Tom, I want you to watch this and see yourself through this young woman's eyes. She didn't see a failed soldier or someone who couldn't handle his duties. She saw a human being in pain who needed help. As Tom watched the video, tears formed in his eyes. He could see his own distress clearly captured in the footage, but he could also see Sarah's genuine concern and the immediate positive effect of her intervention. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he didn't feel ashamed of his struggles. This video has been viewed over 2 million times in the past few hours, Colonel Reynolds continued. The response has been incredible. People are sharing their own stories about mental health, veterans are talking about their experiences with PTSD, and mental health organizations are using your story to promote awareness and support services. Tom was amazed. His worst moment had somehow become a catalyst for positive change and open discussion about issues that were often kept hidden. Sir, I'd like to meet the woman who helped me today, to thank her properly, Tom said. Is that possible? Colonel Reynolds smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Inspector Matthews has been in contact with Miss Mitchell, and she's expressed interest in meeting you as well. However, we need to handle this carefully due to the media attention the story is receiving. Back at her hotel, Sarah was fielding calls from news organizations around the world. Reporters from CNN, BBC, NBC, and dozens of other outlets wanted to interview her about what they were calling the hug that broke protocol. Sarah was overwhelmed by the attention, but tried to redirect the focus toward the important issues of mental health and support for military veterans. I didn't do anything special, Sarah told a BBC reporter over the phone. I just saw someone who needed help, and I responded the way any decent person would. The real story here should be about the challenges that our military personnel face, and the importance of supporting them when they return from service. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a prominent psychiatrist specializing in PTSD treatment, had seen the viral video and reached out to several news outlets to provide context about what Sarah had done. In an interview with CNN, she explained the psychological impact of Sarah's intervention. What we see in this video is a perfect example of what we call therapeutic touch, Dr. Martinez explained. During a panic attack, people often feel isolated and disconnected from reality. Physical contact from another human being can provide grounding and reassurance that helps break the cycle of panic. She continued, this young woman's intuitive response was actually a textbook example of crisis intervention. She provided non-threatening physical contact, verbal reassurance, and most importantly, she showed the guard that he wasn't alone in his moment of crisis. The story was also having an impact on military and mental health policies. Several veterans organizations announced new programs for supporting service members dealing with anxiety and PTSD. The British Ministry of Defense issued a statement commending Sarah's compassion while also announcing a review of their protocols for handling medical emergencies during ceremonial duties. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how one spontaneous act of kindness had created ripples that were spreading across the globe. She had come to London as a tourist seeking to fulfill a childhood dream, but she was leaving as someone who had made a real difference in the world. Her phone buzzed one more time with a message from an unknown number. Miss Mitchell, this is Colonel Reynolds from the Queen's Guard. Guardsman Hartwell would very much like to meet you tomorrow to thank you personally. Would you be available for a private meeting at the palace? This is completely optional, but we thought you might appreciate the opportunity to see how your kindness has affected his recovery. Sarah smiled as she typed her response. I would be honored to meet him. Thank you for arranging this. The first security officer to reach Sarah was a stern-looking man in his 50s with graying hair and sharp blue eyes. His nameplate read Inspector Matthews, and his expression suggested he had seen every possible type of tourist behavior during his years protecting the palace. He approached Sarah with the practiced efficiency of someone who dealt with rule breakers on a daily basis. "Miss, I need you to step away from the guard immediately," Inspector Matthews said in a firm but not unkind voice. "You've violated palace security protocols by making unauthorized contact with a member of the Queen's Guard." Sarah raised her hands slightly to show she wasn't carrying any weapons or threatening items. "I understand, officer. I'm sorry for breaking the rules, but I could see that he was in distress. I think he was having a panic attack." Inspector Matthews studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. In his experience, tourists who approached the guards usually did so for photos, pranks, or to test whether they could get a reaction. But something about Sarah's demeanor and the genuine concern in her voice made him pause. "Miss, I need to see some identification," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "And I'll need you to come with me to answer some questions about your actions." As Sarah reached for her passport, she glanced back at the guard. To her relief, he appeared to be completely stable now. His breathing was normal, his posture was strong, and the trembling that had alarmed her was completely gone. Whatever had been happening to him, her intervention seemed to have helped. A small crowd of tourists had gathered to watch the interaction between Sarah and the security officer. Some were taking photos, while others whispered among themselves about what they had witnessed. Sarah could hear fragments of conversation in various languages as people tried to understand what had happened. "Did you see that American girl hug the guard?" asked an elderly British woman to her companion. "I've never seen anything like it in 40 years of living in London," a young father from Germany was explaining to his children in broken English. "The lady was helping the soldier. Sometimes people need help, even when they're working." Inspector Matthews finished writing down Sarah's passport information and looked up at her. "Miss Mitchell, I need you to understand the seriousness of what you've done. The Queen's Guards are performing official duties, and interfering with them is a criminal offense that could result in arrest and prosecution." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I understand that I broke the rules, and I'm prepared to face the consequences. But I have to ask, is the guard okay? I'm a psychology student, and I could see that he was having some kind of medical episode. I was genuinely worried about his welfare." Something in Sarah's question seemed to surprise Inspector Matthews. He glanced over at the guard, who was now standing with perfect military bearing, showing no signs of the distress Sarah had described. But Matthews was experienced enough to know that medical emergencies could happen to anyone, even highly trained soldiers. "What exactly did you observe that made you think he was in distress?" Matthews asked, his tone becoming slightly more curious than accusatory. Sarah described what she had seen in detail: the trembling hands, the rapid breathing, the sweating, and the obvious signs of panic. As she spoke, Matthews listened intently, occasionally glancing back at the guard who continued to maintain his professional composure. A second security officer approached and whispered something in Matthews's ear. Sarah couldn't hear what was said, but she saw Matthews's expression change from stern authority to something more complex: concern mixed with surprise. "Miss Mitchell," Matthews said after a moment, "I need to ask you to come with me to the security office, but I want you to know that you're not under arrest at this time. We just need to discuss what happened here today." As they walked toward the palace security office, Sarah noticed that several other tourists were following at a distance. Word of the incident had spread quickly through the crowd, and people were curious about the outcome. Some were taking photos and videos with their phones, undoubtedly planning to share the story on social media. The security office was a small, efficient room with monitors showing various angles of the palace grounds. Matthews gestured for Sarah to sit in a chair across from his desk while he pulled up some files on his computer. "Miss Mitchell, I've been doing this job for 15 years, Matthews began, "and in that time, I've dealt with thousands of tourists who approach the guards for various reasons. Most of them want photos, some want to test the guards' discipline, and a few are just looking for attention. But you're the first person I've encountered who claimed to be helping a guard through a medical crisis." Sarah remained quiet, not sure if she was supposed to respond or just listen. Matthews continued, "I've just spoken with the Guard's commanding officer, and he's confirmed that Guardsman Thomas Hartwell has been struggling with anxiety-related issues since returning from deployment in Afghanistan 6 months ago. He's been receiving treatment but apparently had a severe episode today during his duty shift." Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with sadness. Relief that she had been right. To be concerned, and sadness for the young man who was clearly dealing with invisible wounds from his military service. "The commanding officer also told me," Matthews went on, "that Guardsman Hartwell was on the verge of collapse when you intervened. He believes your actions may have prevented a serious medical emergency that could have required hospitalization." Sarah's eyes widened. She had known the guard was in distress, but she hadn't realized how serious the situation had been. Matthews leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah carefully. "Miss Mitchell, technically you violated multiple security protocols today. Approaching a guard, making physical contact, and causing a disturbance are all serious offenses. Under normal circumstances, you would be facing criminal charges." Sarah's heart sank. Despite knowing that what she had done was right, the thought of being arrested in a foreign country was terrifying. But Matthews held up his hand. "However, these are not normal circumstances. The guard's medical condition creates what we call exceptional circumstances, and your intervention appears to have prevented a serious emergency. Additionally, your actions were clearly motivated by compassion rather than any malicious intent." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope, but remained cautious about celebrating too early. "I've spoken with my supervisors," Matthews continued, "and we've decided not to press charges against you. Instead, we're going to issue you an official warning and ask that you refrain from any further contact with the guards during the remainder of your visit to London." Relief flooded through Sarah's body. "Thank you, Inspector Matthews. I promise I won't cause any more trouble. I just couldn't stand by and watch someone suffer when I thought I could help." Matthews nodded. "I believe you, Miss Mitchell, and for what it's worth, Guardsman Hartwell has asked me to pass along his gratitude. He can't thank you personally due to protocol, but he wanted you to know that your kindness made all the difference today." As Sarah prepared to leave the security office, she realized that her simple act of compassion had set in motion a series of events that would have consequences far beyond what she could have imagined. The story was just beginning. Sarah's hands shook as she approached the guard. Every instinct told her to turn back, to blend into the crowd and pretend she hadn't seen anything. But the man's obvious distress compelled her forward. She could see his chest rising and falling, rapidly now, and his knuckles had turned white where he gripped his rifle. The other tourists barely noticed as Sarah slipped through the crowd toward the guard post. Most were busy taking photos or reading guidebooks about the palace history. A few glanced at her curiously, but no one tried to stop her. The palace security officers were positioned further away, monitoring the larger crowd rather than individual tourists. As Sarah got closer, she could see the guard more clearly. Despite his formal uniform and stoic training, she could tell he was young, probably not much older than herself. His face, partially hidden beneath the massive bearskin hat, showed signs of real panic. His eyes, which should have been staring straight ahead, kept darting back and forth as if he was looking for an escape route. Sarah had worked as a volunteer at a crisis counseling center during college. She had learned to recognize the signs of panic attacks and knew how dangerous they could be if left untreated. The guard was clearly experiencing a severe episode, and his training to remain motionless was probably making it worse by preventing him from using natural coping mechanisms. When Sarah was just 3 feet away from the guard, she spoke in a soft, gentle voice. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I can see that you're having trouble. I want to help you." The guard's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment his professional mask slipped. Sarah could see the fear and confusion in his expression. He was caught between his duty to remain silent and unmoving, and his body's natural response to panic. The internal conflict was tearing him apart. Sarah took another step closer. She could now see that the guard was sweating profusely, and his breathing had become so rapid that he was in danger of hyperventilating. His legs were shaking, and she worried that he might collapse at any moment. "My name is Sarah," she continued in the same calm tone. "I'm not going to hurt you or get you in trouble. I just want to make sure you're okay. Can you hear me?" The guard's eyes met hers for just a split second before he forced himself to look straight ahead again. But in that brief moment, Sarah saw a flash of gratitude mixed with desperation. He was clearly fighting to maintain his composure, but he was losing the battle. Sarah realized that traditional methods of helping someone through a panic attack wouldn't work in this situation. She couldn't ask him to sit down, to breathe into a paper bag, or to talk through his feelings. His job required him to stand perfectly still and remain silent no matter what happened. But Sarah remembered something else from her psychology training. Sometimes the simple act of human connection could be more powerful than any technique or medication. When people feel isolated and trapped, knowing that someone cares about them can provide the anchor they need to weather the storm. Without overthinking it, Sarah stepped forward and gently wrapped her arms around the guard's waist in a soft, supportive hug. She was careful not to interfere with his grip on his rifle or to knock him off balance. She simply offered him the comfort of human contact and the knowledge that he wasn't alone. The reaction was immediate and unexpected. Instead of maintaining his rigid posture or trying to push her away, the guard's entire body seemed to relax. His rapid breathing began to slow, and the trembling in his hands gradually subsided. Sarah could feel the tension leaving his muscles, as her simple act of kindness worked its magic. For several seconds, they stood there together in front of Buckingham Palace. The guard, still in his full ceremonial uniform, being comforted by a tourist from Ohio who had recognized his humanity beneath the formal facade. It was a moment that transcended protocol, nationality, and social barriers. The crowd of tourists around them began to take notice. Some started taking photos, thinking it was some kind of special ceremony or interaction they had never seen before. Others looked confused, wondering if Sarah was breaking some important rule. A few seemed moved by the obvious care and compassion in the gesture. Sarah could feel the guard's breathing return to normal. His heartbeat, which she could sense through their embrace, slowed from its frantic pace to something more manageable. Most importantly, she could feel that the panic that had been consuming him was beginning to fade. After about 30 seconds, Sarah gently stepped back. She looked up at the guard's face and saw that while he was still maintaining his official expression, the fear and panic had been replaced by something else: relief, gratitude, and perhaps a glimmer of hope. "You're going to be okay," Sarah whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. "Whatever you're going through, you're stronger than you know. And you're not alone." The guard couldn't respond verbally, but Sarah saw a tiny nod, so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. It was his way of saying thank you, of acknowledging that her kindness had made a difference. As Sarah began to step away, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Palace security officers were approaching, their faces serious and purposeful. She realized that her actions, however well-intentioned, had been noticed by the authorities. The consequences she had been worried about were about to become reality. But before she could feel afraid or regretful, something remarkable happened. The guard she had helped straightened his shoulders and seemed to find new strength. The panic that had been overwhelming him just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet dignity and renewed sense of purpose. Other tourists in the crowd began to murmur among themselves. Some seemed confused by what they had witnessed, but many appeared to understand that they had seen something special. A moment of genuine human compassion that had transcended the formal barriers of royal protocol. Sarah looked around at the approaching security officers, then back at the guard. One more time, Despite knowing that she was probably about to face serious consequences for her actions, she felt no regret. She had seen someone in need and had responded with kindness. Whatever happened next, she knew she had done the right thing. The guard, now steady and composed, continued to stare straight ahead as his training required. But Sarah could see in his posture and bearing that he had been fundamentally changed by their brief interaction. The panic and distress that had been consuming him were gone, replaced by a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from his very core. As the security officers drew closer, Sarah prepared herself for whatever consequences her compassionate act might bring. She had broken one of the most sacred rules of royal protocol, but she had also possibly saved a young man from a serious medical crisis. In her heart, she knew that the choice had been worth it. Sarah Mitchell had dreamed of visiting London since she was 12 years old. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she spent countless hours watching documentaries about the British royal family and reading books about Buckingham Palace. At 28, after saving for 3 years, she finally had enough money for her dream vacation. The plane touched down at Heathrow Airport on a crisp October morning. Sarah pressed her face against the small window, watching the English countryside roll past. Her heart raced with excitement as she thought about all the places she would visit: Westminster Abbey, Tower Bridge, and most importantly, Buckingham Palace, where she hoped to see the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Sarah had planned every detail of her trip. She carried a worn notebook filled with addresses, opening times, and carefully drawn maps. Her camera hung around her neck, ready to capture every precious moment. This wasn't just a vacation for her. It was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream that had sustained her through difficult times. The taxi ride from the airport to her small hotel near Russell Square felt magical. Sarah stared out the window at the red double-decker buses, the black cabs, and the ancient buildings that seemed to whisper stories of centuries past. Everything looked exactly like the postcards she had collected as a child, yet somehow more real and magnificent. After checking into her hotel, Sarah couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed her camera and map and headed straight for Buckingham Palace. The afternoon sun cast golden light on the busy London streets as she made her way through the crowds of tourists and locals. Her excitement grew with every step. When she finally turned the corner and saw the palace gates, Sarah stopped breathing for a moment. The massive iron gates, the red-coated guards standing motionless as statues, the grand facade of the palace itself. It was even more impressive than she had imagined. Tears of joy filled her eyes as she realized she was actually standing in front of one of the most famous buildings in the world. Sarah joined the crowd of tourists gathering along the palace railings. She listened to the excited chatter in dozens of different languages as people from all over the world shared the same sense of wonder she felt. A family from Japan posed for photos while their young daughter pointed excitedly at the guards. An elderly couple from Australia held hands as they gazed up at the palace windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty. The guard nearest to where Sarah stood was particularly striking. He was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his mid-30s, with the characteristic red tunic, black trousers, and enormous bearskin hat that made him look like a figure from a fairy tale. His expression was completely blank, his eyes staring straight ahead as if the hundreds of tourists surrounding him didn't exist. Sarah watched him with fascination. She had read that the guards were not allowed to speak, smile, or react to anything the tourists said or did. They were trained to stand perfectly still for hours, regardless of weather, noise, or distraction. She wondered what it must be like to have such incredible discipline and focus. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah noticed something unusual about this particular guard. While the others maintained their stoic expressions without any difficulty, she occasionally caught tiny signs that this one was struggling, a slight tension around his eyes, an almost imperceptible shift in his breathing pattern, a subtle change in the way he held his shoulders. The tourist crowd grew larger as evening approached and the light began to fade. More people pressed against the railings, cameras clicked constantly, and children called out questions to the unresponsive guards. Sarah found herself studying the guard more closely, trying to understand what made him different from his colleagues. Then she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The guard's hands, which should have been perfectly steady as they gripped his rifle, were trembling slightly. It was barely visible, but Sarah's keen eye caught the subtle movement. She looked more carefully at his face and realized that beneath the professional mask, something was very wrong. The guard's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Small beads of sweat were forming on his forehead, despite the cool October air. His usually perfect posture showed tiny signs of strain, as if he was fighting an internal battle that no one else could see. Sarah felt a wave of concern wash over her. She had studied psychology in college and recognized the signs of someone in distress. This wasn't just the normal challenge of standing guard duty. This guard was experiencing something much more serious, possibly a panic attack or some kind of medical emergency. She looked around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the other tourists were busy taking selfies and chatting among themselves. The other guards remained focused straight ahead, following their training to ignore distractions. No one else seemed to realize that something was happening. Sarah faced a difficult decision. She knew that approaching a royal guard was strictly forbidden. Signs posted around the palace made it clear that tourists should maintain their distance and not attempt to interact with the guards in any way. Breaking this rule could result in arrest or, at the very least, being forcibly removed from the area by police. But as she watched the guard's condition continue to deteriorate, Sarah realized that following the rules might not be the right thing to do in this situation. Her instincts told her that this man needed help, and she might be the only person close enough to notice his distress. The guard's trembling had become more pronounced, and Sarah could see that he was struggling to maintain his composure. Whatever was happening to him, it was getting worse, not better. She knew that royal guards were trained to endure extreme conditions, so if one of them was showing signs of distress, the situation must be truly serious. As Sarah stood there wrestling with her conscience, she remembered something her grandmother had always told her: sometimes being kind is more important than following rules. Her grandmother had been a nurse during World War II and had often spoken about the importance of helping people in need, regardless of the circumstances or consequences. The crowd of tourists continued to grow, pressing closer to the railings and creating more chaos around the struggling guard. Sarah realized that if she was going to act, she needed to do it soon. The guard's condition was clearly worsening, and she might be his only hope for getting the help he needed. Taking a deep breath and summoning all her courage, Sarah made a decision that would change both her life and the guard's life forever. She was about to break one of the most sacred rules of royal protocol, but she knew in her heart that it was the right thing to do.